Good morning. We're going to get rolling and catch an extra minute or two here. This is our short session, so we're trying to squeeze every minute we can. Glad you're here. Thank you for coming in early on the first day. A little round of applause for the audience showing up. Thank you. Appreciate it. I hope you're excited for something a little bit different. So this is a community event called the Extracurricular. It's the second year we've done it. Last TDX was the first time, and the format's a little different. So my name's Chuck Liddell. I'm the CEO of an ISV that does integrations called Valence, and I'm one of the organizers that put this together. And it came from a desire to have those kinds of conversations you have in the hallway at a conference like this with really interesting people, and try to turn that into an actual session you could attend. So what we're trying to do here is artificially stimulate a conversation that you're going to have with the people that are up here in front, and that they're going to have with each other. And hopefully, if we get this right, this will be the most conversational session you've ever been to. Really, it's the whole room kind of talking with each other and with the speakers here. So it's a long session. We have about 75 minutes, and we're going to do a basic presentation and then get into some Q&A with the panel here, and then we'll open up for audience questions. So please kind of take notes as you listen. Think about things you'd like to ask questions about later, or maybe add a story or some color commentary to later. We've got mics front and back, and we'll kind of help you have this interesting conversation that I hope to have. So let me introduce the people that you'll have up front here. Our main speaker today is James Ho. And James is a technical architect who is currently consulting at Google. He began his career with a focus on solving business problems and ended up self-teaching programming to do it. Since then, as both systems and groups he works with have increased in complexity, a different layer of challenges began surfacing. To answer the question, how can I do this better, it became a personal goal to maximize reusability and create consistency while developing applications in Salesforce. So sort of wrangling the circus here today is Carrie Townsend. Carrie is our moderator for the session. Carrie is a manager in the Salesforce business group at Accenture. She has been working with Salesforce for over a decade and is passionate about community events that challenge thinking and provide a platform for peers to learn from each other. And assisting Carrie, we have two panelists here to ask interesting questions. We have Brett Nelson. Brett Nelson is a software developer who has been working with Salesforce.com since early 2016. Brett is a consultant with Just Some Apps. Prior to working in the Salesforce land, Brett spent 4 years working with the .NET technology stack, focusing on web development with MVC, Angular, TypeScript, and Aurelia. Beyond the technology, Brett is passionate about continuous improvement through learning, sharing with others, and collaboration amongst the geek society. You can read or view Brett's ramblings at wipdeveloper.com and follow him on Twitter at BrettMN, and his obligatory Salesforce certification count is 3. All right, and our second panelist, Moyez Thanawala. Moyez is a Salesforce developer and architect at T Digital in Dallas. He holds degrees in electrical engineering and computer science from SMU and has served on dozens of design committees, including notably the very first IBM PC clone hardware and BIOS design team in the early 1980s. Since 2009, Moyez exclusively develops on the Force.com platform. He leads the Dallas Salesforce Developers Group and is a Salesforce MVP. So great to have you four on stage today, and please take it away, James.
Cool. Awesome. So today I want to share a story with you, kind of my journey through a little bit of development. I came from Visualforce, I went to Aura, and finally I'm on LWC. So this is to share kind of the journey I made and the decisions I made through that journey, the learning pains, the ways I solve for things, and kind of just go through some of my thinking patterns. So I'll start like about 3 years ago. I knew that Lightning components were going to be a thing. I knew that Lightning was going to be something we'd have to learn, but at that time I didn't know to what extent. So starting with the UI namespace Lightning components, I had like 1 ear to listening what was happening, but I wasn't quite ready to take that on yet. It wasn't until roughly winter 17 where I had really seen the potential for Lightning components, and that released in the form of the base components, which is the Lightning namespace components. From that, moving forward, I had 2 years listening, and I wasn't ready to use it yet, but I knew that I wanted to use it. So roughly spring 17, I wrote my last Visualforce page, my last Visualforce SPA. Towards the end of that project, I had maybe about 1 week extra where I really wanted to dive in and learn Lightning components. And the first few slides you'll see are kind of the learnings from creating basically a Hello World component. There was not much usability in it, but I wanted to use that time to kind of deep dive into, how can I use this thing in my future solutions? And so I rolled out that last Visualforce page, and then I had to use Lightning out to wrap an Aura component. Really simple. It was like HTML, CSS. I could have done it in regular HTML, but I wanted to do it in Lightning. And so the next few slides are kind of the learnings of the initial, what did I learn, what was painful, and how did I go about resolving that pain? What you'll see on this is the general eventing system that I had to learn when moving from Visualforce to Aura. For those familiar with Visualforce, there's not too much front-end code where you wouldn't do like a jQuery or re-render panels, kind of just bouncing back and forth server-side state and client-side state. In Aura, this is the first thing that we had to learn, was event-driven programming. You'll see all the steps on the side. You either create a component, you have to register it, grab it, parameterize, fire it, finally handle it, and use it. So for me, I saw myself trying to write this over and over, and I realized, I don't want to write all the syntax. This is really painful for me. So what I did was, I thought about, if I had to write this over and over and over, what would I do? So I came up with the syntax first. Hey, if I wanted to do this all the time, how would I want to do it? So my version 1 was, okay, I just want a very generic thing and fire a very generic thing. And I kind of went down that train of thought. I said to myself, okay, if I had to use this every day, I had to either through the beginning of a business process, end of a business process, fire tens, hundreds of events, how would I do it? So I came up with V1. And I knew I might need to put some payloads in there, simple strings, maybe complex payloads with lists here, that there. But I thought, okay, that's great, but I want to make it even shorter. So then 1.5, I kind of moved some of that stuff into the helper. I kind of made the syntax for myself a little bit easier to write. And at this point, I had no idea how to handle it. There's no way, I just knew how I wanted to use it. And I kind of started connecting the dots from the beginning and started connecting the dots from the end. I didn't know how it was done end to end, but I knew what I wanted to try. Well, you work backwards, or at least I did. I knew I wanted to fire some kind of method. I knew that through my research and through that Hello World component, there's some kind of mechanism of which I can access an inner components method. And so I worked backwards from that. I had to write a generic event, hopefully just one event. We'll see if it works. At that point, I didn't know the object was going to be very flexible. I just knew that it was going to be flexible. And I wanted to make sure that this can work for both component events and app events, because I knew at that time there were the two eventing mechanisms. And so I just registered those. And this is kind of where the light switch turned on, was let's just write these as methods. OK, that's cool. But then how do we get to the actual event? So you work backwards, you move forwards, you work backwards a little bit, and this is what I came up with, was just to wrap these things in generic fires, and then hopefully, this would work. I had no idea at the time. I just knew I just wanted that short, simple syntax. This is how you handle it. So I didn't get to this until the very, very, very end. And this was a little bit of my JavaScript. Wasn't that strong back then, but I had to go learn a little bit of JavaScript. I think switch cases might be a good use case here. So I decided to have this fire mechanism, this generic event key system. And on the other side, I wanted a generic handler as well. So firing different keys, possibly parsing values, maybe taking complex values here. So in the payload, this is the JavaScript object, hello and world. So at this point, I thought, OK, I can go with this. Let's try this out. So how do we put it all together? Here, we're doing what's called a service component. So all the things that those APIs I wrapped were in the EventService component. I composed that on top of my component, as a child of the parent. And then, I wrote my code like normal. But when it got to firing events, to make it much less painful for myself, I leveraged my event service. I made it so that whenever I wanted to fire something, I didn't really have to spend mental energy thinking about it. I just did it. is very opposite of what my learning curve was at the beginning of Aura, which is there's so much things to like balance and register and handle, and I don't want to think about all that. I just want to fire the event. I just want to get this thing over there and have it handled. So this is kind of the step-by-step of just less syntax, generic event service, generic handler, parse the keys, do stuff with it. So that was great. I had, at this point, spent a week of my life writing a Hello World component, didn't like how it did, this seemed promising, but then I saw another problem. In the Hello World component, I went to go to client server, and there was a bunch of boilerplate code. And this is part of that boilerplate code. You had to connect the component. You had to get the method, you had to set the parameters, set a callback. And for me, from a non-JavaScript world, setting a callback before you fire it, that was a little bit confusing for me. So you set the callback and you queue it and fire it, and you maybe optionally set some parameters. That was, I couldn't wrap my head really around that. So again, I tried to figure out how I wanted to use the syntax. That's what this was. I modeled it after the same service mechanisms. So same thing, fetch account comma box. We'll dive into the implementation later, but that's basically a method. You pass it either a payload or you get the callback. And then you process it. You'll see that none of this stuff here in queues, fires, it doesn't do anything like complicated. What it really does for me is have a centralized way to make things more readable. And that was one of the biggest things for me, is making things readable. I want to be able to scan my code, understand consistently what's happening. I don't have to think about like all the framework problems. I just want to think about, okay, what's happening in the code base. So you've got this simple service component, and then you pass in this component, and then it's going to go grab the fetch account comma box, and it's going to get some kind of data back. What is it actually doing? So we kind of follow the same mechanisms for event service, and at the end of the day, I just wanted to make it easy for myself, so I did this. I made every single component, service component, attached to a controller, and I just did the same thing. I had methods in there, possible some parameters. You'll see the first one doesn't have any parameters, but the second one does. And going through the code a little bit, you'll see that I just made a centralized dispatcher because I really didn't want to repeat myself. So I just had a helper and queue all the actions. But I decided to keep at least this layer kind of bound to each Apex method, so that if these parameters change, I can change it here. A little bit of boilerplate, but not too much. So for myself, I thought this was going to be pretty good. I thought this might work. So did the same thing. Data service, grab the data service, fetch the account comma box, get the data back, set the data. The problem here is this line, data.items. One of the challenging things for Aura and LWC is just managing server-side state. And coming from Visualforce world, it was pretty often I used wrappers, but not in this specific context. Actually the first time I tried this, I tried to bounce back select options, but Aura wouldn't allow that. So for those of you who know a little about wrappers, I decided to wrapper it. And so this is my first version of passing server-side state back to client-side. You create a new data wrapper. What is a data wrapper? It's an inner class with a list of items that's constructed on creation. Well, what are items? They're basic value labels. And so I'm just querying for accounts here, and then making sure they're unique, and then putting some account IDs and account labels. And that's kind of the data set that the combo box wants. But this is a lot of work. I thought this was hard. I thought this was too much syntax. So again, to make my own pain go away, I made it simpler for myself. This actually wasn't until about 3 or 4 months in, but I lived with the pain a little bit until I realized, there's got to be a better way to do this. So I figured out that this data type, map string object, love it. You can do all kinds of fancy things with it. You can basically make it like a small wrapper class with none of the syntax. So you do the same thing. You make a little bit of a wrapper, assign a value key, a label key, put that individual option into a list of them, give the map string the object. And actually, this returns exactly the same as a few slides back, data.items. So I realized that the Aura components, they didn't really care how it was wrapped, so long as it had a key. So data was what was coming back from server. Items was the actual collection. So this actually parsed out completely fine back on the Aura side. OK, cool. So I've got event service. I've got a data service. I can basically drop my data services into different components if I want. I can have one Apex class backing all of them. Great. There were still some minor pains. I won't go over these too deeply, but we can go through them in the Q&A. Another pain I had was I really like modals, but making modals were really difficult. This is just some of the boilerplate from the documentation. You grab the overlay library, you figure out what you want, create them dynamically. You basically inject them back in and have overlay just show it to you. I like modals from a UX perspective, but this is a lot of work. So I went through the same invention mode. I just want to make the syntax really easy for myself. So I started going backwards. I wrote the syntax I wanted, then I figured out the implementation later. Same thing for data tables. This is some of the boilerplate in the documentation. You've got all this boilerplate, copy-paste. You get as many columns as you want, and then you get your data, then you set your data and queue it, et cetera, et cetera. Again, way too much work. So I decided to sockle it. I wanted a very simple way to go grab data table columns, data table data. So I just worked backwards from that syntax. This one took a while, but at the end of the day, the data table service just comes back with table columns and table data. You just set them straight, and there it goes. What does this all mean? It means consistency. It means readability. It means, I didn't understand at the time, but it means the ability to bounce events around your Flexipage and having really loose connected components. So at the beginning of all my components, I have the same boilerplate, a data service, maybe more than one data service, event service, which kind of connects them all together. And it wasn't until about 2 weeks into using it, I realized, wait a minute, I can have these things live on the Flexipage anywhere. They're not connected at all. So I'm bouncing app events around through event service and having these little components all over my Flexipage being completely isolated, completely dependent of each other. If they exist at the time, sure, great. We'll bounce an event and send some payload over. If they don't, payload goes nowhere. Doesn't matter. So you've got these little encapsulations of logic who help your components talk to each other. And you'll see that this one has data table service, but no data service. So when I'm scanning my components, I know that this one doesn't have a server-side call. Well, it does, but it's through data table service. It doesn't have the regular server-side call. I do know that data service is being used in both account and contact components. I know that basically all of my components have event service, and all of them have message service, but not every single one. I'm going to switch over to the iPad real quick and show you what this means, because I didn't realize this until about a few months in, was the ability for completely isolated communication means you can do whatever you want to your components. There we go. So really rough drawing. This is a record Flexipage with a header. I have 2 Aura components in here, and I'm using event service to bounce back and forth. But if you're like me, you're not 100% sure that your stuff is going to get used. You're not 100% sure that all your user acceptance testing is going to go OK. You're not sure if what you're making is what the business needs. So at this point, I've made a bunch of components on my page. I can delete them. I don't need them. I can reorganize it. I can put it in the tab. I can put it on the main page. I can just nest it. Doesn't matter where it goes. Event service is that loose thread connecting everything together. And it wasn't until roughly 3 months in I realized, event service, the app events, they're the most powerful tool I have because it lets me leverage the Flexipage. It lets me put things anywhere I want and have that strong separation of concerns where I don't have to worry about it. So let's go back and connect it to this. I had realized there's a lot of Aura talk, but we're actually moving into the LWC age. One of the things I learned when I moved to LWC was most of that knowledge was transferable, mostly in the design of the loose coupling. What I mean by that is a lot of the pain I took for writing Aura and I had to solve for, that was solved already in LWC. You'll see on the screen here, the top half is kind of my generic eventing system. The bottom half is LWCs. They have a generic mechanism where you pub sub, and it does basically the same thing. So you fire a key, you fire a value optionally, and then you register a listener and you handle it. So for me, that was immediately comfortable. I already was doing this, but now this is being handled by the framework. So awesome. Second thing, I was wrapping these methods in data service, composing my components with a bunch of data services at the top. Okay, there's actually an equivalent now in LWC. This means I don't have to have any of that overhead. I don't need to have the data service methods. I don't need to have my own firing mechanism. I don't need to have my own queuing mechanism. That's being handled. So I actually took the exact same code, threw away the Aura wrapper, and just imported the Apex method directly. I won't get too far into the LWC syntax, because that's what the Trailhead is for this year. But basically what I want to show you was, moving into LWC, there's a lot of that knowledge that I spent 2 years over that kind of is very transferable. This is how you put it all together. So you've got the same mechanisms where you're grabbing some kind of server-side state. Those data.items, same way. I didn't change too much of the actual getter for the Apex. You wire it back, you set it on the page, and then you fire the account selected, which is the account ID. So this is the event service and the data service basically being completely obsoleted, which in my opinion is a good thing, because I don't want that overhead. And this is how you handle it on the other side. So you saw we fired the account selected mechanism. Well, we registered it, and then we handle it here. It's really easy, really straightforward. There's no overhead. Now, what does this mean? Moving forward into the LWC era, personally, I've written a lot of Aura components. I started to think about my own challenges in that stack, where I have these loosely coupled Flexipages, Aura components everywhere, and I realized I needed my LWC to talk back to my Aura components. That was a problem, because there was not currently any strong way to do that except to do what we see here, which is to wrap your LWC in an Aura, bounce the event up to the parent, and then use the parent, which is the Aura component, to do something. Yeah, that's viable. But I also didn't like the feeling. I felt like it was not a great thing to wrap every single LWC in Aura. And conversely, sending Aura communication down to LWC, you had to find it, figure out what you want to do to it, and then call some public function on the LWC to send it a payload. That was too verbose for me. So I went through the same invention, the pain reduction, and this is something I'm currently working on, so not 100% sure it'll fly in the future. But I decided to figure out how to relay messages back and forth between LWC and Aura. I decided to call this brokering, and this is something that is currently working, but I feel like could be better. So I've decided to leverage the pub sub mechanism, broker some kind of payload from LWC over to a hidden handler on the page, have the handler bubble up an event to the Aura component, and have the Aura component talk back to my existing components. The primary driver of this solution was to make sure that whatever I wrote for the past 2 years still worked, but could scale from moving forward, making sure my current components can talk to my old ones. And that's pretty much my journey. It was about 2 years of writing Aura and realizing that some of the mechanisms I used in Aura, separating my concerns very strongly, putting them on the Flexipage, and then loosely coupling them with events, that translated 100% into LWC. And the takeaways here are we shouldn't ignore developer pain. We are our own end user, and we should be able to advocate for ourselves to kind of make feature requests to reduce our own pain. And that's what really started this whole journey was I felt that there was a little bit of friction in what I was making, So I wanted to make that friction less. And for my own anecdotal discovery, VF to Aura, less pain. Same gap from Aura to LWC. And although the syntax is really different, the learning is the same. You want to loosely couple your components on the Flexipage and then make sure the event model works back and forth, whether or not the LWCs exist on the page. Server-side state management, same exact thing. You can use list of DES objects, you can use dot notation, you can use the wrapper I was doing, you can use the map string object I was doing. Same exact data set creation. Composing Lightning web components in a Flexipage, it allows you the flexibility to kind of move however you want at the speed of whatever you want. Because at that point, you've created these loosely coupled components. Kill them if you don't like it. If the business doesn't like the UI, kill those. Reorganize it. Do whatever you want. It's really hard to do that in a Visualforce page. Like you have to actually push code and reorganize the UI. In a Flexipage, just drag and drop it. Put in an accordion, take it out, whatever you want. The other thing is, through my journey, I picked up a lot of JavaScript basically because I had to. There was a lot of things about ES6, ECMAScript. You learn about that in this trailhead. But basically, learning LWC, learning JavaScript, it's going to give you a productivity boost, hands down. Everything here, there's actually a Git repo. I have the service components in the Aura flavor. I have some LWC utils, which actually show you side by side of a full working app. What does it look like in LWC? What does it look like in Aura? So I tried to make this for my own sake. I wanted to learn, make sure I was doing it correctly, but I want to share that with everyone here. You can take all these, they're in SFDX format, and just pull them down. These slides are on my GitHub as well. SF Exchange Discord is a community that I am in pretty frequently, and join us, come talk to me. We can help you out with LWC, but it's a great community, and these guys are smart, and then we can help you with LWC if you need. Yeah, and that pretty much concludes my journey. About 2 years of Aura, moving into LWC. I love LWC. It basically reduces my friction by 30%, 50%. There's way less syntax. A bunch of stuff is being handled by the platform. It's a pleasure to write, actually.
I think you'll agree that that's a well-deserved round of applause. So unlike other sessions, we're looking to make this a real conversation, but I just want to say a big thank you to James, because even as he's going through talking about the process, just observing someone going through their process, you pick up a whole load of information. And for someone that has not done a great deal of development, this has been fascinating for me to understand how someone who works in the space day in, day out actually approaches some of these challenges and problems. So as I said, we're looking to make this very much a conversation. There was a huge amount of engagement in the audience. I could see everybody with their necks craned upwards, just in some cases open-mouthed. Which is amazing. So I'm hoping you also have a lot of questions. So we'll welcome questions, but also if you are interested in, if you've been through a similar journey and you're interested to share some contrast, some light and shade to what James has talked about, we'd also love to hear some of that. I'm also interested to get a feel for where people are in the room in terms of whether people are still working predominantly in Visualforce. Can I get some hands if anybody's still predominantly working in Visualforce? Okay, in Aura? Okay, much more. And then already moving to LWC. Okay, so you've gone through the full plethora of the journey, so I'm hoping that we'll get some contribution from you as well. We're going to start with our panelists. So I can see that you have a selection of questions there, so I'm hoping that some of those are going to be nice and chewy to start with, because, it's early, and James is keen.
I don't know about chewy. We'll try. James, first of all, fantastic conversation. I really appreciate that you brought this to the forefront today. Those of us in the room who are going through the same journey have attempted on our own to build our own frameworks to alleviate some of the pain in Aura. With varying amounts of success. But one of the items that I know is in the forefront of everyone's mind is profiling. As we build these frameworks and we load them as they get used under production load, in some instances in large orgs, we're finding that our own frameworks occasionally fail or perform quite ill. And I'm wondering if you've had the opportunity to think about the performance issues of building your own Aura framework as well as communications between Aura and LWC.
Right.
How have you profiled it? Can you kind of give us an insight into some of those issues that you might have faced?
When you say profile, you mean the performance profile?
Yes, performance profile.
So I actually didn't realize this until much later. Because I liked nesting my components in tabs and accordions so much, there was very little performance hit. Because what happens when you nest the components in accordions and tabs is, on the tab click, the component loads. So if you've got 10 tabs across the top of your Flexipage, and you have a super expensive component in each one, only one of them load at a time. And so you can kind of change how you load the page by just putting it into the framework of the Flexipage. Conversely, you can actually wrap everything in like a tab set, and then just have things load on click. I find that from a user experience perspective, as your computer screen loads, you can only consume the information you see at the time. Everything else outside of what's in the frame, you don't have to load. And I just lucked out in that the Flexipage framework doesn't load what's in the hidden tabs. Does that kind of answer?
It does, and so you're kind of doing a delayed load as it's called upon.
Yeah, and I think I saw this in the communities maybe like two releases ago, but it had something like where optimized loading, where it would load from the top down, and I was like, oh, that's a cool option. But basically, it's the same idea where you paint what the user sees and you don't paint what they don't see.
Excellent, thank you.
Okay, so we'll take a question from Brett, and then we'll throw it out to the floor. So if you have any questions, if you could make your way to the mic, and then we'll work through you in order.
So, great talk, by the way. But my question would be around your dispatcher or pub sub broker. That's what you call it.
Yep.
Are you able to use that then to communicate between the LWC components that are peers or children of peers, so to speak?
Peers or children of peers? Like sideways?
Yeah.
Like, okay, yeah. Yes, if you pub sub everything, you can actually, so I'll maybe show you what it looks like. Actually, we'll just go through the code. Let's go look at the actual code for the broker. So Event Broker itself has a bunch of public APIs. Okay, that's a little bit. You've got broker message to LWC, and that uses the pub sub. So like you can have another LWC register the listener if you want. I've got the force refresh view API, which doesn't exist in LWC yet. I did try to do app events and record events. That's special for console. There's also broker event to Aura. So there's a bunch of things you can have the broker do. But to answer your question specifically, I use the pub sub mechanism to kind of broker to peers. Okay. And then to children of peers, it depends on how wide the scope of the event you want. Because if you have just the child register the listener, yeah, just pub sub it. But if you're going down hierarchy, you can use attributes on the parent, or not attributes, yeah, properties on the parent, no. It just depends on what you want to send over, even if you want to propagate it from parent to child. But this pub sub mechanism, I do like quite a lot. I'm hoping they roll that into the framework rather than the custom one. But we'll see.
And you just mentioned that, scroll down some, please.
Yeah.
Where was it?
Where we
You're
going?
doing app events for the console? Or the
Oh, record event. Yeah, okay. So I learned this through my own pain. I didn't realize. When you fire an app event in Aura in Lightning Console, the app event actually goes across all the tabs. And I didn't realize that at first. So I was wondering, wait, why is my other record Flexipage getting this app event? And I realized I had to scope it. So I basically parameterized an app event to look at the record ID. And so now I have a way to bounce app event within the context of a record Flexipage. And I wanted to use the same mechanism from LWC into Aura Flexipage if I'm using Lightning Console.
Okay.
Yep.
Yep.
I just want to say that the app event behavior in console apps is the reason that app events don't exist in LWC,
Yep.
because that was such a tough problem to solve.
Yeah.
So that it just didn't make it into LWC to avoid that weird behavior where you had multiple tabs open and they're getting the same event.
Yeah, it's something that I figured out a little late, and then I realized there's a kind of mechanism now, which is the page ref. There's actually a pull request in my own repo where I realized the page ref wasn't behaving 100%, so I had to scope the page ref with a record Flexipage ID. So there's a little bit of wonky behavior that you kind of have to solve around, but it's doable, yeah, for sure.
I'm a little curious as to, did you look at doing anything with interfaces in any of your work?
In the Aura components, like extensions?
Yes.
Yeah. So as a general ethos, I prefer composition over inheritance. So I want to be able to see quickly how my component is composed. And that's kind of why at the top of my components, there's a really quick composition. So like, just, okay, that's what's happening here. I don't have to think about the interfaces. I don't think about the inheritance models. I don't have to think about anything, really. I just look at what's declared compositionally. Yeah.
Well, part of the reason I'm asking is that, as we all know, Lightning Web Components are not supported in the console. I'm looking at, and we don't know when that's going to happen. I'm looking at a new Lightning for a new Lightning console application that I've got to build,
Right.
And I want to include the Lightning API for components, and I'm thinking about including that as an interface.
When you say interface, are we talking about the implements Flexipage available for all types here? Are we talking about the
I'm talking about implements that API.
the top of the line here, the available for all types, that thing?
No, I'm thinking about implements, the Lightning, I'm sorry.
Oh, no worries.
That API for the console API.
Oh, you're talking about the one that lets you manipulate the tabs.
Tabs and
Got it.
so forth, exactly.
Got it, I'm following. Yeah, that doesn't exist in LWC yet. So what I do is broker the event over to Aura and then deal with it.
Right.
I don't know if it's in my public repo, but there's actually, I use the exact same mechanism where any LWC I have now has access to every Aura API by virtue of the brokering. So I kind of just like relayed it over.
So you're able to use an LWC for the console?
Yeah. So generally, the brokering event system, what it opens up is the ability for LWC to payload something over to an Aura API. And you can use that very powerfully. One of the things you can do is you can have an LWC open a modal through Lightning Overlay Library because you broker the event all the way to Aura, and Aura is the one that's actually handling the opening.
Yeah, because I really don't want to put the LWCs in the wrapper. As you
that
were
was the
talking
pain I
about.
didn't want to do.
And so I'm loath to go there. And
Yep.
ideally, if we're going to build LWCs, we'd like to be
Yep.
able to build them so that they can be used any place.
I completely agree, and that's why I wrote the brokering system. So it's in my public repo. You can pull it down. But basically, LWC, payload over, Aura handles it from there, and it feels like Aura at that point.
Okay.
Yep.
All right, because that's what I've been struggling with
Yeah.
is I really don't want to have our guys build
Yep,
more.
that's exactly what I did that.
So thank
Totally
you.
get it.
That answers my question.
Yep.
Could you go a little more into like handling lots of data and like large records? Like say I got a table and you're trying to search through hundreds of thousands of records. You mentioned some with Flexipage where you have some other tabs that will hide it, but also you mentioned a little bit about like accordions like inside the table, or like how do you think about letting people search and filter and look at lots of data?
You said hundreds of thousands of rows?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. That one's harder, I'll put it that way. I will give you my ethos on that, and then I don't think it scales to hundreds of thousands of rows, so you might need to do some things there. So my general ethos is I actually like sending all the data to client side. So I do what's called like a cache. So I actually call these like get something cache, get X cache. And they're actually a very generic sockle, usually scoped to the record ID of the Flexipage. But then I actually return everything to the client. And then I start using JS maps, JS filters, JS reduces to put them into different collections. What this allows me to do is I have all my data client side, and then I can manipulate it with front end only. Hundreds of thousands of rows, though, I don't think data table will render that very well in general. I actually like using Lightning Data Table and Lightning Tree Grid almost exclusively. But building your own data sets and iterating through hundreds of thousands of rows, there's going to be performance issues there. I think generally, you would still need an on-key up or on-filter query to grab the data set you need and bring it back, and then filter on that maybe.
It's more like in the UX filter.
Yeah.
Force the user to filter down, and then
I think for your use case, you might still want to have like a scoped sockle of some kind, rather than just bring the whole I deal with like thousands of rows, not hundreds of thousands of rows. Yeah.
Thanks.
I just want to jump in on that. I feel like if you start handling that level of scale, you have to have a server-side piece to it.
Yeah.
It's pretty heavy in the mix. Like
Pretty heavy. Yeah.
sorting or filtering or searching, you always want to cover like the whole database and then serve some paginated set to the front end. So you work on that much data, you end up inevitably having some sort of heavy server piece that's
I think so
maybe
too.
part of a framework, but there's a heavy server piece, like full stop. You got to have that.
Yeah, I think in my own experience, Lightning Data Tables start slowing down at about 1,000 rows or so. Roughly between like 1 and 1,000, you can kind of get that front-end filtering really fast. There's a few techniques I use, but basically return the data, key in something, and then filter it through JavaScript, and then return the dataset, filtered dataset back on, and commit that dataset to the data table. 1,000 is kind of where like that weird gray area is, but if you go over that, it's going to be real painful for the user.
Hi, have you done any benchmarking of page load time between Aura components and Lightning Web components?
Seat of the pants, yes, but I have not done formal benchmarking. I know that LWC loads faster in certain circumstances. So going through the lifecycle of an Aura of LWC component, let's go open one real quick. So there is a performance gain, like hands down. I don't know what it is, but do you remember maybe 3, 4, 5 releases ago when like Lightning got much faster? That's because everything went to base components. Those base components were actually LWC under the hood. That was kind of my impetus to kind of start writing LWC because stuff was just faster. I have my own assumptions on why they're faster, but I know for sure a couple things. Let me show you real quick. That's not a good one. That's okay. Let me see if there's another one. Well, they're not in here. So there's a couple lifecycle events. There's constructor. There's connected callback, which is the equivalent to do init. And there's rendered callback and disconnected callback. So like on the bootstrapping of an LWC, a bunch of things happen. Between connected and I think constructor, the wire runs. So the wire runs like ever so slightly before connected callback happens. So what you get there is like this mechanism in your framework where stuff is preloading and pre-caching before the actual component's even connected to your DOM. So I use this trick to wire stuff in. I know like won't really change or might change very few times, and I want that data before it really loads. So you get a little bit of that snappiness in the load because the wire pulls it in so quickly. And there's the other technique in LWC where you can declaratively get stuff, which is called, I think, imperative calls. Those are like regular calls where you do those after connected callback. So after the component like bootstraps into your DOM, then you do imperative, and then you get like regular functions. But basically, I think the load times are faster not because of the data getting, but because there's less Aura to load.
Yeah, moving away from a framework that would use polyfills and whatnot to fill in features for browsers that aren't supporting like certain feature sets, the going to the browser native API for those would be the reason for the increase in performance, because the browser vendors have had an opportunity to optimize the workflows or something like that.
So we've had a number of questions for the audience. I want to take some more questions from the panel and see whether any of the questions that were prompted also on the floor, you would either elaborate or had further questions on them.
Actually, I do have kind of a top-level question here, moving away from exactly this conversation. A lot of us are now finding ourselves becoming JavaScript programmers.
Yeah.
And you know, I'm an old guy. You can see that from my gray hair. And so C, moving to C++,
Yep.
and then moving to C# and Apex and now JavaScript.
Yep.
We kind of feel that the young whippersnappers have it all wrong on JavaScript. How have you managed in your own work to keep tabs on going from strongly typed in Apex to not strongly typed in JavaScript, from being not case sensitive in Apex to being how do you keep all that straight in your head? Do you have some best practices that you can share with us that work across the board that you've found to be useful?
I don't know about across the board, but I do know that more of my code uses switch case because I use it so much in Apex now because I write it in JavaScript. So that kind of like merged. I use map string object a lot now because it's very close to a JavaScript object. So I had the mental friction, like switching context, and I try to bridge that in at least the language parodies, so at least I don't have to think too much about it. It is difficult, though, keeping track of two things moving forward, which is how to handle your data client side, and then how to generate that data state before you hand it off. There's a couple of techniques I use on the server side. I've recently adopted what's called a builder pattern. So instead of having like a straight constructor, there's actually no examples, but you do like a builder where you call an Apex class and then you feed it parameters through like just English. So set X to this, set X to this, and then you do .build at the end. And what that does is it generates state. And it generates state in a containerized class, which you just throw over to the client side. And then from there, you can kind of like deal with it. It comes out from the server as this giant JavaScript object. And you can like inspect certain elements of it. You can like take the collections generated and put that into like wherever you want. But I have noticed that a lot of my Apex code is to serve the client side state now.
I just wanted to jump.
As opposed to the other way around.
Yep.
I want to jump in on that a little bit and say, like, with LWCs, Salesforce, I don't know if you can hear me, that sounds weird. With LWCs, Salesforce uses a lot of TypeScript under the hood, using a jsconfig.json, and it automatically builds a bunch of TypeScript patterns that mimic what Apex controller classes and methods you have and what parameters they have. And it's using a lot of that to help make sure that your stuff is correct and complete, and to know that you're passing the right number of parameters, you're passing controllers that actually exist, you're referencing static resources that are real, you're referencing custom labels that are real, that you're getting your casing correct. There's also another side of this. If you're doing a lot of Aura development, can you leverage some of that? And you can, this is a punt ahead to my session at noon in this room, and that is using TypeScript inside of Aura components. You can still get a lot of that assurance. You can still get a lot of that case safety and knowing what things are available. Sometimes it's a lot of work. Sometimes it's a pain. But JavaScript, if you're leveraging some of those technologies, if you're doing LWCs the way that Salesforce has got you set up, they still help you a lot. They give you a lot of autocomplete. They give you a lot of checks and completeness.
Thank you.
Hi.
How's it going?
I'm Matt. This was useful. Thank you. I'm not a developer, so I mash code up and then give it to a professional developer. So I have a lot of respect for this discipline that you've given an example for. So my question is, you've got real strong ownership over this framework you created, right? And you could navigate around here and you could say, oh yeah, here's an example of this, here's how I'm going to do that. So you know this because you wrote it.
Yep.
So two parts really. Is it suicide for people to try and use Lightning components in general without some kind of a framework? And what is the learning curve, do you think, in terms of either writing your own framework within an organization or adopting? So I'm kind of looking at it sort of from you come in and before the development team just goes off and does whatever the hell they want, how do we put them on some rails?
Yeah, that's a great question. So to answer your first question, it wouldn't be suicide. Like, it's completely doable. The issue with that is consistency across your teams. So when you're writing in a silo and you're following what the documentation has, it seems to me, at least the way you create events, like you could have some reuse. And it's more about reusability across your team than following what the documentation says. You can do it. I think it's completely possible. And it's kind of what, in the early examples of Aura, is being done. You make all those things, and then you do it the way documentation says. The opportunity to standardize and make things more readable and make things more consistent, that's kind of the call of the architect or the lead of the team if they want to do that. Writing your own framework, though, or at least starting down that path, to me, it's usually about what's my return on interest? Do I want to spend X weeks dealing with this to reduce 10, 15, 20 hours per project where I don't have to deal with it later? So it's one of those cost things where, is this worth sinking time to make it easier for myself? And it was yes for all the reasons I showed you here, but no for a lot of the other reasons I didn't write frameworks around, and I just used Aura as it is.
I'm going to make you work a bit harder then. So we save time on the front side maybe, right? So your 10, 20 hours thing. But I'm not interested in that, right? Because it's always been, in the history of computing, the latest new thing is always 5 times faster developing the new thing than it was in the old thing. It's rubbish, it's never true. Maintenance, longevity, preventing corrosion, that's what I'm interested in. So, I mean, can you kind of answer again from a maintenance perspective? Does it change the way you deal with it?
So in the context of Aura, so there's 2 contexts there. The Aura context. A lot of my peers, and when they were learning Aura, it's too verbose. So from a maintenance perspective, you've already lost a point there.
Yeah, I was laughing at your overlay example. I did an overlay for the first time in preparation for my talk, or so on later. This is what we're up here for. But it's nuts. It's crazy.
Nuts.
It doesn't even flow right. So I really identified with your examples of this didn't feel right. It doesn't feel right.
Sorry, what was the original question?
So the original question was about preventing corrosion and framework for maintenance purposes.
Yeah, so the maintenance part, it already lost a point for me because it seemed really hard to maintain. Like the eventing system and just having this bunch of boilerplate code. Yeah, you can copy paste it all over the place, but if you break it one place, it's gonna break everywhere else. So you have to Control F everything and replace it. So from genericizing all that into a generic event, anyone looking at my components, they can expect okay, this is all the same thing. It's loosely connected here. And at least this one scales. But to your other point on, is it worth the time cost? It really depends on the overall skill set of the dev team if they want to undertake a framework. If everyone agrees that, okay, we should head in X direction, then I think everyone kind of adopts that best practice within that team. But whatever's right for your team may not be right for another team.
Cool, thanks.
I agree that overlay library is the worst.
It is the worst.
So let's start with that. I hate that thing.
Yeah.
All right, quick question and then a longer question. Quick question is, I saw that you had some sockable in JavaScript that you're sending back to the server, and you probably don't want to hear this question, but are you doing anything to prevent injection attacks with that?
No, that's actually just a sample. But yeah, you can clean that on the server side, and you can obfuscate it a little bit before you send it server side. You can not even have that. What I actually have in production is that's not being in JavaScript. It's actually done through the app builder through a design attribute.
Okay, well that's a great segue into my next question, which is, this is all very technical and in the weeds. How do I make this real? I want to build Lightning pages.
Yep.
How does this make my life better?
Yeah, It's a great question. So generally, none of this stuff really matters anymore because LWC takes over a lot of the onus. The primary thing that I wanted to kind of push forward is the Flexipage itself has become this like cornerstone of my applications, which I can just kind of throw stuff on. And making that leap through the thinking of just loosely coupled components and just put them whatever you want on the Flexipage. That's the primary learning that I wanted to kind of move forward into LWC space, where I think just composing your apps using tiny LWCs. For example, I have a lot of tabs in my apps, so I typically do like 6, 7 tabs and do LWCs in them, but I realized that you can actually put native components on the side of it. So I've got like report charts on the right, you've got data making on the left, and then you refresh the report, you see the report. You can't easily do that in like a regular SPA. You can't drop a report chart component like in like a pure like Aura or LWC page. You have to use the Flexipage. And so to kind of make this real, it's more about taking the learnings of just composing your components and putting them in the Flexipage rather than using this framework. The framework served a purpose for about 2 years, and then LWC took over a lot of that overhead. But the learnings from the framework on loose coupling, learnings from the framework on state generation server side, all that stuff still applies.
Hello. So last year there was a really interesting talk on the notion of these, I would say, complex JavaScript apps, right? Where you've got a lot of state on the screen and all these different components, and user might change something over here, or an event comes in from somewhere, and somehow you've got to get all this state, right? That's referenced by all these components. You've got to keep it in sync somehow.
Yep.
And so there was this talk last year, and it was kind of it's similar to like like the flux pattern or Vuex, or these things that solve that in arguably a fairly elegant way. Mm-hmm. Does anything that you've built here address that kind of state problem? And if it did, great. If you can explain it. If not, I mean, how is that something that you've addressed or dealt with?
Yeah, that's a great question. To your original point, those are great for like real SPAs, like actual SPAs where you want like some kind of state management pattern. I typically have things so loose where it doesn't really matter, where I have a data service component which actually gets the initial state. And I actually cache that to the component through like a wire or something so that if a second component gets it, there's no server-side call. So this state generation mechanism I can paint into each LWC specifically, but I don't propagate changes from one to all of them unless I need to. If I do, then I throw an event over. But to answer your question, I think there are a couple people trying to adapt Flux into LWC or some kind of like generic state manager. I have not approached that, but I also have not found a need to approach that. Just because by virtue of just keeping things in the Flexipage, I may not have those 4 tabs I thought I was gonna make. I may just kill them. And so for I'm gonna go back a little bit. My SDLC involves a lot of MVP making and prototype making. So there's a lot of like, okay, let's try this, see if it works. Nope, doesn't work, kill these things, kill these things. And so the business and myself, we go through a learning process through the UI, through the UX, and the way I've approached my framework is to kind of support that, where I'm not sure like V1 is gonna make it to V2 or 3. And I wanna make sure that I don't do things I won't need, so a little bit of you aren't gonna need it. But does that kind of answer your question?
I have a follow-up question to that. So if you have you're relying on the wire service to cache the responses, and so if you have 5 different components that use the same object, it's one call to the server. But if one of those components updates that object, how do you handle that?
Yeah. So it depends on what I'm getting. In your example, are we talking? So taking a step back, Lightning Data Service is like the easiest example of that, where you grab an S object and like that's kind of cached client side. The kind of stuff I'm getting is like a giant wrapper of like this, maybe a collection here or there. I typically mutate those and then immediately save and then fire an event for the other thing to refresh and grab it again. I don't throw the new stuff over client side. I just tell the other thing to refresh.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hi, good morning. Just one question, like how this framework will work in mobile. Like I don't want to repeat two framework for mobile and desktop. So how this will work?
It's a great question. I don't know. So for the mobile kind of interfaces for Aura components, I'm not sure if app events and component, I'm sure component events work. I don't know if app events work because there's no like second page.
Because in Trailhead, they given some samples. When I go through that sample, they said you open in mobile, it will work. But when I tried, it's nothing happening.
Yeah, that's an area I don't have expertise in. I know that data service components would work because that's just trying to get data from
That
the
is
server.
a generic one. It will
Yeah,
work.
eventing I'm not sure on. I know that overlay library is supposed to be supported in mobile, like much better than trying to throw your own CSS on the page. I do know there's some level of handling in mobile for overlay library. Data tables are a straight no in mobile.
Okay.
But yeah, as you can see, my primary focus is on desktop.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Does anybody else in the room have any position on mobile that could add to that?
Hey, thank you for talking. Really interesting. You mentioned using standard components on Flexipages as well as the normal ones. Do you use anything else like declarative in your code, labels, anything else you might pass on to us?
Oh, okay. So not in my UI, but I actually use a lot of Process Builder. So I actually do like Process Builder a lot for prototypes and MVPs because what that gets me is the ability not to write a test because I don't know if that's going to stick for V2, V3. So the way I approach Process Builder is you kind of have like one separation of concern. So you have one Process Builder doing DML and the other one's not doing any DML. And then you can have like your trigger. If you get to V2, you move all your DML to the trigger, then you have your Process Builder to maybe do like emails or something. So like no DML. In the UI, no, I can't. I don't use flows in the UI, but I've been wanting to. I don't use guided actions, but that's possible. That's actually another possibility. So if you've got like native stuff on your Flexipage and you want to embed like this suite of applications on the left panel, that's when this loose coupling works really well because you can have like this stuff your admin builds. You can have the stuff that you use like flows or guided actions. You can even have things in the utility bar kind of eventing to your Flexipage. But the idea is that these components target a very specific UX or a very specific use case. Have them be embedded in your workflow, not the primary workflow, which takes up your entire screen. That's the other reason why I like modals so much. You can interrupt a workflow with a very specific workflow. So like, okay, I'm doing all these things, click a button, my entire UI is blocked until I figure this thing out. And I like doing the overlay library over the CSS mode where you kind of just like hide or open the overlay CSS. I think it's a little cleaner. And also I wrote a whole like framework around it, so like there's no pain.
So I just want to come back to the panel. Do you have any other further questions?
One last question, sorry. Chrome plugins for LWC, right?
Yeah.
What are you using and what are you not using and why?
Nothing. I don't use anything. Okay. So there's personal reasons on nothing, but also corporate reasons on nothing. I generally don't like things manipulating my DOM that I don't own. So like Chrome plugins like bypass that entirely. I mean, use them if it benefits you, but personally, I don't have any actually.
Really? Okay.
Yep.
Is there anyone else from the floor? And they're off. Who can get there first?
I have to beat Matt.
Yeah.
All right. As far as debugging these things, do you have any patterns, practices, hard-won experience for debugging these, especially when you have application events that are reaching across different things?
Chrome plugins?
That would be a new
I'm thinking about Lightning and
I know from a high level how they work, but I've never written one, so like that might be kind of wonky. To answer your question, I actually don't turn debug mode on, but sometimes I feel like I should. I generally console.log a lot. And then I actually have a, so there's, the proxifier. There we go. That thing. I do that a lot. Like that basically unproxies it for me. I feel like that's faster than turning debug mode on. And then if you want to undo the first layer, like you can do that in ES6 for LWCs. You can explode it out. You can deconstruct it, but that only gets to the top layer. If you have a collection under your object, that doesn't unproxy it. So then you just do this one, like it's fine. Yeah, like it's just to see your state, but that's actually like it copies the object a little bit. But yeah, I use this a lot in my debugging, and then I just like pop open like what's happening in my object. To the events specifically, ever since I wrote the framework, like I know when things are gonna happen because of the way the keys are parsed, so I don't really have to debug it. Like the framework has been solid for like 2 years. I haven't touched it in like 2 years. EventService was the first one I wrote, and I haven't touched it in like 2 years.
Thank you.
It's console.log, isn't it?
Oh yeah, we're console.logging these out. Sorry, yeah. These are just to break the state open. But yeah, you console.log that thing out.
So this one's a little bit associated. So you started talking about guided actions and flows. Now that's very interesting. So are you going anywhere near getting back to the good old days where we used to have, like a server-side service where, we'd have all of our logic and process stuff, rather than tie stuff up in triggers, right? So, as I look at projects now, I'm starting to wonder, can we get back to a much more, what I think is a much more sustainable service model rather than, trigger hell, right? So
yeah, are you talking specifically about having stuff in flows? Or?
Well, I mean, I could see that, you could have, you've got a good component framework like this with the event messaging, the event component, which I could see is very powerful. This now, to me, sounds like it's giving me the pieces I need to sort of, go through a business process, right? Because we're writing business systems most of the time, kids. It's not, air traffic control system.
Yep.
So, it's like I go through a business process, and at the end of that, I'm going to have some data, which I'm going to update some records, right? And I would very much like to see us get back to that and get away from where we're at. So I just wondered, following on from your guided actions comment, if you kind of gone down that path.
Yeah, so this is where I'm personally heading back, is I'm trying to figure out how to get flows back into my workflow. It's one of those things where I've gone through writing all these components, but the main thing I learned was this encapsulation of the component, exposing APIs out, making sure that events can come in. Like, because I had to write these in the Flexipage, I really needed these to exist standalone. The side effect of that is it's so standalone, you can drop it in a flow. So there's this model where you're right, where you can kind of offload your concerns for heavy processing into like an LWC or Aura component, and you can embed that thing in a flow. And you don't have to go through triggers. You don't, well, you probably need some Apex, but like you would have your UI in the flow, and you would have that button called like a service class, and the service class would execute stuff. You could bypass your trigger. That being said, there is value in having this processing in the service class and having multiple callers. So you can call it from a batch class, you can call it from like a trigger handler class, but basically everything offloads to the service class. One of those entry points is an Aura component or LWC component in a flow.
Yeah. Okay, good. That was just a bit of therapy I needed, but that's it.
No, I think it's viable, and that's the direction I'm going towards.
Yeah. Cool.
Just a minor add-on to that, and then I'm going to get behind Cal. There's no read-only mode for an Aura LWC invoked Apex. You can have read-only mode if you're in a Visualforce page. So one weird thing that I do for heavy processing, like Matt was asking about, is I actually have a VF page in read-only mode that I use JavaScript remoting to call from an Aura component. So I can get into read-only mode from Aura. It's kind of a hack.
Wow, that's pretty smart, yeah.
You can break into read-only mode from Aura and do large-scale processing.
Interesting.
I don't know if I should have told you that.
Yeah, I mean, at this point, there's so many tools in the toolbox. It's just how creative you get in like patching them together. But that's an interesting one, yeah.
My question is a follow-up to Chuck's previous question. He was asking you about SOCL. And what I think I heard you say was that by putting your components on a Lightning page, that essentially the security was handled by having it on an application page. Is that what I understood you to be
Yes
saying?
and no. So from a high level, I operate in an environment where there's high trust, and there's not like external users. There are some, but I don't use that technique over there. Generally, I haven't had to defend against that specifically, other than I want to make sure the sanitization happens server-side. So for me, it's not too important that they can see the sockle string. It's more important that, like, when I'm parsing this string server-side, I escape everything and I make sure that the stuff is handled like closely server-side. It's okay for me to have like a sockle string if they inspect like the JavaScript on the internal browser, but I actually do parse and escape stuff when that string gets server-side and I start doing the parsing to construct my data.
Okay, because internal users are every bit as dangerous as external users.
I agree.
Okay. So that's why I was asking this question as a follow-up, because if you were an ISV,
yes,
all right, you would not pass the security review. So,
yeah, for ISV, you probably have to figure out a different technique for sure.
All right, so that's why I was asking the question, because inherently I could not see how, you know, your app template was going to handle your security, because it's just another Lightning component.
Let's see. At that point, you may want to offload to like a configuration object where you have the sockle string stored in like an encrypted object record, and then you figure out how to, for that page or something, get the associated sockle string and then load that into the...
Well, normally an ISV would basically create a service, you know, so, and get back to the SOA type of service. So that's why I was asking the question, because I was like scratching my head and saying, well,
yeah, you'll see like none of my stuff is really ISV ready. Like there's a couple of layers you have to do to get things ISV ready. And I operate more like on the internal client delivery. Yep.
Yeah, well, and that's personally, that's what has always scared me about Lightning for your average run-of-the-mill customer of Salesforce, is that security is every bit as important to them internally, because you can have users that get mad at the company and then they do whatever they want and then they leave. And they can really mess up a lot of data in an org. So at least that's my personal perspective.
Yep.
So, okay. That answers my question.
Thank you.
So you talked about this a little bit before, but I was hoping you could get into it a little deeper.
Yeah.
I think one of the most interesting things about this talk is sort of the coexistence of Aura and LWCs side by side, and especially the communication between components that are siblings, right? But that come from different frameworks, the two frameworks.
Yep.
And could you talk a little bit more about just a lot of people in the next couple of years are going to run into this, where they have a lot of legacy Aura and they're trying to add LWCs and they're going to live side by side on the same page for a while. And what sort of challenges does that present that you've overcome or seen that you could clue us in on ahead of time? And you know, what have you addressed and how did you make it work?
Yeah, so as we move forward in time, I'm thinking and hoping that there's going to be less gaps in the actual LWC APIs. So there's going to be less of a need to like throw things over to the Aura side. Other than the general skill set divide, the largest mechanisms missing right now are the feature equivalency in LWC. Things like force refresh view, things like overlay library. There are actually some GitHub repos which deal with, okay, let's say you're clean slate. Let's say you want to have one event system. Someone actually has a version of EventService, which is called like one event. And so you have one event that kind of fires everywhere, and all Aura and LWC can react off that. So if you're starting from clean slate, it might be worth kind of just connecting that stuff, or you can wait for Salesforce to kind of figure something out for us. It may or may not be viable to wait. So it does go back to the question, is it worth making your own framework? Sometimes it's a yes because of a business need. Sometimes it's a let's hold off and just wrap stuff in Aura.
Hi. is there anything available for LWC for testing, like any tool, Jasmine or Karma we can use, or?
Yeah, so in general, there's a bunch of Jest tests, and they're actually in the public repos from Salesforce themselves. I haven't written any Jest tests because I have a QA team, but that's something I want to get into. Is I'm actually in a wait and see mode for like what the patterns. I've been following Stack Overflow, specifically the Salesforce one. Okay. There seems to be some pain around generating complex tests. So personally, I'm just like waiting to see what the solves are before I undertake them.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, let's talk about flow some more. All right, so we talked. Okay, so we talked about using using standard components, custom components to compose these flexi pages, and how awesome design attributes are. Everybody, thumbs up. It's great. Let's talk about flow a little bit. Just like, okay, so we've talked about flow as a nav model. Can you just talk about that a little bit more and what you think? Some kind of like maybe what the best practices will be. Because like on my side, I've used it as the nav because I don't want to build nav. Next, why not? Like, so we just have separate. Independent individual components in the flow. It's worked nicely for me so far.
So I'll preface this with I'm not great at flows. One of the things that I think a flow could offload for me is wizards.
Yeah,
that's what so like you basically have these loosely coupled components, which are your screens, and then you pass the state between them as you advance forward. And I'm pretty sure, I haven't actually done this, so this is still prototyping. I'm pretty sure you can save the state of the component 1 to the flow, and then for component 2, like bring it back.
Yeah, so they can, using the input and output, they can relay between each other. And then we've also experimented with having the component on the flow, like the flow screen, it's just its own kind of, I guess, application.
Yeah, basically.
And then the trigger for it to write to the database or whatever is whenever they leave the screen.
Yeah, that's one of those places where like if I had a use case for a wizard, like that's where I'm going next. So I have the architecture in my head. I just need a use case to like apply it to. Wizards are one of those things, guided things where you want full control of what's happening in UI is a good use case for flow. Having a modal open and like basically have like 2 screens guide you through some heavy processing, like that's a really good use case for flow.
Right, cool. Great, I want to share with everybody too.
Yeah, I agree.
So we're into the final few minutes now, so I wanted to see if anybody else had a question. And if not, I'd like to hand it over to the panelists for any final remarks, and then finally for James, if there's anything that we haven't already got into in this session, and I feel that we've covered a reasonable amount, but if there's anything burning that you had left that you wanted to impart on the audience, I just wanted to give everyone the opportunity to do that.
Let me just make one final comment. We're a consultancy in Dallas, and we work with enterprise clients, and this topic for us is very, very timely. We've got a lot of components that are already in production in Aura, and as a team, we're making the decision to not build any new Aura where possible, and so we find ourselves stepping on the accelerator, and we're finding the same challenges that you are, right? New technology. Sometimes things kind of get a little bit messier than we're capable of handling. The takeaway for me is that we have assets available to us in the Jameses of the world and Stack Exchange. Go there. If you haven't already committed to moving your org or moving your clients, I think this is a stable technology. You will see speed gains, absolutely, without a doubt. So my takeaway is, yes, commit to it. We're not on the bleeding edge. We're on the leading edge. Time to jump in.
Yep, I agree with that completely. And that's kind of where I'm going is I don't write any more Aura unless it's to gap some kind of a thing that it's not in LWC. I've moved completely to LWC, and there's been a lot of gains in terms of my own productivity. Fully agree with those statements, and that's kind of where I'm going.
So wanted to say that this was a great presentation. I've done a lot of work in Aura and LWC for various different clients, and I always end up remaking what would essentially be considered a framework almost with every different client because
Yep.
there isn't a place I've put it all, but this seems like something that would be worth looking at. But so even if you aren't, so whether or not, I guess the point is, whether or not you decide to go with a framework like this, you are deciding to build a framework even unconsciously. And then your various different projects are going to have the slightly differences to them, and maintaining it might become more of a hassle than, anyway, I think this is a great approach. So.
Thanks. Cool.
Lovely. Well, on those final remarks, I'd like to thank everyone. So James, our panelists, and everybody that stood up and asked a question and joined us this early in the morning. I think this sets a great precedence for the conversations that are going to happen in this room for the next 2 days. So I would expect to see a number of you here for the whole day in this room with no windows. So I hope you enjoy the rest of your time here and come and talk to everyone.